The other types of justice, interactional justice, is it's akin to procedural justice in the sense that it's about interpersonal treatment, the fact that people feel that they're being treated with respect and dignity. But in this case, it's not about the treatment they receive from formal authorities, but the treatment they receive from other members of their community. People want to feel, as they go throughout their day and everyday lives, that other people are treating them, other citizens are treating them with dignity, with respect, that they have some status in that society or in that community that is being respected when people are interacting with them. And what that means is that they don't feel that they're victims of discrimination or of exclusion. These are very, very important, fundamental human things that contribute to a sense of fairness and justice. Retributive justice, people need to feel that there's some proportionate degree of compensation or punishment in many cases for past injustices. And the problem with that is it can often lead to feelings of vengeance that can lead to disproportionate responses. But that's also a human universal response in many ways, but it's one that needs to be dealt with within institutional constraints and affordances. Restorative justice is a more recent spin in some sense on retributive justice, and it's a way of repairing relationships between parties who feel that they've been treated unjustly, and it's a way of restoring a sense of dignity and respect and status to people who feel that they've been treated badly by other people, or whether it's by fellow citizens or by formal authorities. And these are the interventions that have been designed to bring people together and to try to have them interact in a face-to-face way in order to understand and accept and in many cases, if it's possible, to forgive and to move on. But in any case, to feel again that people are understood and that their opinions and their reactions are being taken seriously. Many people have commented already that it's very difficult to get people to agree on what social justice requires. This is, for thousands of years, it's true. Human beings have been grappling with these issues and these questions. It's often easier to get agreement on injustices. People often feel, for at least clear injustices, our emotional responses are in many ways the same, and we're able to build upon those reactions in order to address what seem to be the clearest injustices. So in some cases that might be a way to move forward with agendas that on which broad agreement is possible. But of course there are many obstacles, many barriers to bringing about social justice. Resistance to change is, in my view, another human universal. It's very difficult for people to consider very new ways of doing things. Things that are familiar to us since childhood have a way of becoming automatically accepted by us, have a way of being legitimized, have a way of being passed on to us. They become important to us. We're psychologically attached to things that are familiar to us, and therefore we're often defensive and resistant to things that involve real changes. There's lots of barriers. I'm a social psychologist, so I'll just mention a few social psychological barriers or factors that contribute to resistance to change. One of these is simply self-interest or vested interests, as someone said earlier. Whatever the status quo is, there are some people who are benefiting in clear ways from that status quo, and it's obviously going to be difficult for them to be considering giving up some of the privileges and prerogatives of the status quo for them. And so special arguments are going to need to be made, often about longer term interests in terms of stability and ensuring a better future, a stable future for everyone. But that's a crucial issue. Social validation or group support for existing ways of doing things, social norms. Social psychologists often refer to these as the modern founder of social psychology, Kurt Lewin, argued and discovered really that it's often easier to change the opinions of an entire group of people rather than trying to change the opinions of individuals within that group without addressing the other members of the group. And the reason for that is an individual alone, taken aside, might be persuaded of the importance of something, but when they're put back into their community or to their social group and there's no social support for that new opinion, it simply is weak in the face of the social norms that are reactivated. And so what he did was, this was in the 1940s, during the food rationing in the United States, Lewin and his collaborators went to communities and met with neighbors, with people who were responsible for household nutrition and so on. They met with people in groups of neighbors. They provided them with facts and information about nutrition, about cooking healthy meals given the constraints of the food resources that were available and so on during the war, and had them then engage in group discussion with democratic norms of free disclosure and working through towards consensual agreements, understandings of things with input from experts where necessary. And they found that when people in their communities discussed these new food standards and these nutritional facts and ideas, they were much more committed to them in the long term afterwards, and they had now social support. The other members of the community who participated in these groups were also their neighbors, and so there was social support for these new beliefs and practices, and this was much more effective than individual attempts to educate people about these things. A third factor is about the source. Who is it coming from? People are, whether someone is influenced by a given argument, no matter how good the argument is heavily dependent upon whether they perceive that source, who the message is coming from, as credible, trustworthy, attractive, and so on. Someone they identify with, someone who's similar to them. So it would be crucial, I think, to get valued members of the community, popular members of the community. Every social network has nodes of people who are highly influential within those networks. You want to have them be passing on these messages, I think. You want religious leaders who are valued and respected and trusted in their communities to be communicating consistent messages. Other types of respected leaders in societies to be delivering compatible messages to people, or they simply won't be accepted. And then finally, oftentimes changes are resisted because they conflict with pre-existing beliefs and ideologies that people have, much of which is constructed, these belief systems are constructed in a way that not only makes sense of existing ways of doing things, but often explains, justifies, even rationalizes the way things have always been done. And these belief systems can themselves be powerful obstacles to change, especially when it comes to social justice, in my view. So one of the ways to work around this is, instead of attacking these beliefs head on, which only provokes defensiveness in many cases, is to try to see if there are ways of reframing the message in certain ways that it makes contact with the belief systems and ideas that people already have about society and the fairness of society and so on. There are other obstacles to full participation. Frequently, members of disadvantaged groups don't feel equipped to communicate. They don't feel that they have the skill set to openly discuss and debate issues of civic importance. And so there's a necessity to work with people to make them feel more comfortable, often in face-to-face settings. They need to feel some hope. Again, this gets back to voice, that there's that what they have to say will be taken into account in some ways. And this is an emotional thing almost as much as a cognitive thing. They need to not only expect that their opinions will be heard, but they need to feel that in some way in order to want to participate. As I mentioned, people with vested interests, members of advantaged groups are also going to have good reasons, frankly, for not wanting to change. You asked for examples and models. I mean, one thing I think of Nelson Mandela, who, there are many things about his handling of the situation that were genius, but one of the special parts of genius in dealing with the transition from apartheid, in my view, was that he successfully communicated and persuaded whites in South Africa that if the African National Congress got everything that they wanted and were successful in their struggle, that the lives of whites in South Africa would still be comfortable enough, perhaps not as comfortable as before, but he was able to convince whites that they would they and their children would have sustainable, positive, stable futures, and that things would not be terrible for them on day one of the new regime. There are a few other examples that might be worth mentioning. One is a movement for what's been called deliberative democracy, which in many ways attempts to put in place some of the lessons from Kurt Lewin's group decision-making situations. But these have been very large-scale exercises undertaken in many parts of the world, throughout Europe, in Asia, some I believe in Africa and perhaps in the Middle East, as well as the Americas and so on. There's a professor of political science at Stanford named James Fishkin who's been behind this move in recent years of deliberative democracy. He points out that oftentimes citizens don't have strong opinions about things, and they don't feel well informed, and that if you have a combination of experts being on call to provide information, to answer questions of ordinary citizens, and then have the citizens themselves with that input discuss together, move toward consensual decision-making in these face-to-face groups, that the quality of solutions is vastly improved, that people feel committed to the solutions that are being put forth, and governments throughout China, for instance, have been using this model of deliberative decision-making to manage the local budgets for governments, and my understanding is it's been extremely successful. There are limitations to this method, just as there are limitations of really any method that any of us come up with along these lines. And one of the limitations is it sort of treats every individual as simply an interchangeable individual. They go to great pains to do statistically representative random samples of the population, but when they bring people in, people are individual decision makers who are expected to behave rationally on the basis of the information they've received and to work through the problem-solving task. 1 minute to go. I'm sorry. Okay, one minute. Okay, sorry. And the problem with that, the limitation of that, is simply that it doesn't necessarily get at fundamental tensions in society, especially between groups, because people are not really there as representatives of the groups that they represent, but more as the average citizen in some sense. But there are ways, I think, of incorporating and making it more complicated. One other example is the Global Community Project that has been put forward by Morton Deutsch, who is a social psychologist now in his 90s at Columbia University, who has been arguing that what we need is to figure out ways of getting every citizen of the world, everyone on the planet, to identify with a social group that is as expansive as the human race in order to tackle problems like environmental problems. And the identity that he's trying to build is actually based on the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights that was ratified in 1948, as well as a speech by Franklin Roosevelt in 1941 about the four freedoms, which are freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And I'll end on that note. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me now turn to the very extreme left of, not necessarily in political spectrum dimensions, although it may be. Dr. Diwan, I would like to hear your views on ways to integrate social justice in the main political economy discourse. This is a much broader question, of course, in the region. How could this impact on development policy making and planning? Rather than having this concept as the flavor of the day, how can we ensure that it's effectively and permanently mainstreamed into national and regional policy agendas? Again, what are some of the lessons from recent experience of attempting to integrate social justice into national development strategies? What can you say about that?
Thank you, Federico. Well, I mean, first, it is the flavor of the day, so I want to start by congratulating ESCWA for bringing us together around such an important theme, and it is the theme of the day. But then, of course, your question is crucial. How can we ensure that it's not just the flavor of the day? How to put in some sustainability in this issue? And I think that the panelists have answered half the question. It's institutions that would deliver in a sustainable manner. But the other half, I guess, is about what does it take to build those institutions? And I think it's simply political support, right? I mean, politicians need political support in whatever and they do. And the question after the Arab uprising is, is it عدالة اجتماعية, and will there be massive political support for that? Now, I think a secondary question that is as important, many panelists also put on the table, is social justice in what context, political and economic? I mean, are we talking of a socialist system, of markets with redistribution, of a capitalism a la China or a la Latin America? What variety of capitalism? So the question posed by خبز حرية عدالة اجتماعية is bigger. I mean, we know what عدالة اجتماعية, we can guess what it is, we can guess what حرية is, but what is خبز exactly? How should it be produced? I guess is a question that Jihad also raised. And so I'm asking, what do people want, right? It's a very good question to ask. And we all assume we know the answer. It's really good that we ask this question. I mean, it shows that we're in a unique moment, because in the Arab world since the beginning of the 20th century, this question was not asked. There were ideologies that took what people want, their aspiration for granted, and maybe for good reasons at those historical moments. You had the liberalism with kind of reformation of Islam in the beginning of the century, which perhaps thought that growth would solve all problems. Then we had the strong state, the Arab nationalism, somewhat socialist, import substitution period that really counted on social mobility, on building up the middle class as the driver of economic transformation and social and political transformation. Then we had, of course, the system went bankrupt and collapsed, and we had structural adjustment. And I guess with structural adjustment, it wasn't clear anymore what regimes wanted, right? I mean, it was the Washington Consensus. To what extent was it something people wanted? Nobody asked. And that to a large extent led to the malaise. And in many ways, what these protesters said is, we don't want this kind of neoliberalism. The new political settlement didn't have social justice, even though the Washington Consensus was selling social justice in the guise of markets with redistribution. So what kind of capitalism do people want, maybe is the question. And are their views coherent? They may well be not coherent. So to that, I want to talk a little bit about my own recent research, which is to look at opinions in the Arab world. And we're lucky that there is a lot of data now on opinions. The World Value Survey just concluded its wave 6, where it looks at 12 Arab countries, which is a big improvement over the past. The Arab Barometer, Gallup, we have lots of things to look at. And when we look at these surveys, asking what is the evolving Arab identity, if you like, I mean, obviously there are lots of variations across countries, across individuals within countries, in terms of age, education, but several things come very, very strongly. And one of them is the average Arab is not unlike the average global middle-income citizen. The evolving identity is pretty close to the trends globally. Another is that it is true that the youth are different in the sense that the change seems to be happening through generational change, and the youth are more individualistic. They want the good life, they want to work hard, they believe in democracy, they believe in the market. They are kind of leading in terms of opinion change. And in terms of the key questions we're asking, do they actually want what you all think they want, which is market with redistribution? The answer is an amazing yes. They want markets. I mean, when you look at questions about, are you comfortable with competition? Is competition good for incentive, or does it bring the worst out of people? Are markets good for growth, or do you prefer more state involvement? The average Arab is much more pro-market and pro-competition than the average middle-income person in the world, and this is very striking. And when you look at questions about redistribution, do you think the role of the state is to redistribute from the rich to the poor? Again, strikingly, the average Arab is more to the left, if I may say, than the average middle-income person. And so in a way they are incoherent in that they are on the right on market and on the left on the redistribution, but in a funny way it's a very coherent view of the world. Perhaps it's related to Islam, I don't know. Some people have said there is no theory of social justice in Islam, but there is a practice of believing in market and growth with, however, social justice as redistribution, fair market and redistribution. So this is comes out very strongly in this data. Another thing that comes out strongly is the fact that people see a lot of corruption and don't like it, and correlate corruption in business and corruption in government. And so a lot of the talk about the late period of crony capitalism, where regimes that were autocratic wanted to open the economy without losing control, political control, so really they ended up giving the height of the economies to kind of loyal friends. This is a strong perception among the average Arab that this is not good for growth. They dislike that, and people that have a high intensity on that feeling also tend to be less strong for the market. So I mean, clearly this is an issue that we have to keep in mind. I want to add one thing about preferences and then go say a few words about institutions. The weak side of these opinions, when you read them and you're thinking about social justice, is related to these vulnerable groups that you spoke about. When you look at questions about gender equality, the region is pretty much below the MIC average in terms of inequality. There is a gap, there is changes. You see the youth being more progressive, more educated people being more progressive, if I may say progressive, on gender equality. Women being much more pro-gender, towards gender equality than males. And so there is a gap, young, old, but there is an even bigger gap, male-female. And we see after the uprising a movement towards gender equality, as if it has been a liberating moment, and that would have socioeconomic impact over time. So that's one big issue. The other big issue is on social tolerance. The region is relatively socially intolerant. You know, people of other language, of other nationalities, of different social behaviors. People don't want them as neighbors, much more than in other parts of the world. And also there is a problem with religious tolerance. When people are asked about whether people of different religion are morally okay, there is less acceptance of religious differences. And so this is to say that, in a way, listening to the people or the democratic order or political support will be very helpful for a politician on the issue of market with redistribution, and that seems to be indeed the model that has kind of bubbled up in shaping the identity of the region. But one has to be careful in terms of inclusive growth, and there is a role for the politician in, and for organizations and associations in actively promoting change in values among the population as well in terms of inclusion. I want to say just a few words about institutions. I mean, there were plenty of excellent comments by the panelists, but I mean, if the goal is markets with redistribution, then the how to reform the institution is an extremely complicated question, because it has to do with markets, fair markets, and we're coming from a period, at least in the transition country at the very least, which as I said, has a lot of cronyism and networks of influence, and therefore a lack of competition, and therefore no growth, or not much innovation. And on the other hand, redistribution, the role of the state is very important, and we're coming from a period where, at least outside the Gulf, where we have poor, overstaffed states, and so we need massive reforms of the state so that it can deliver social justice. Now, on the first issue of how to regulate markets, this is an extremely complicated question that Europe is still dealing with, or other capitalistic countries. Is much easier to direct the economy from above, as our countries have done in the 60s and 70s, than to promote a private sector that is fair, that is dynamic, that is well regulated. It's much more complicated to have institutions to regulate competition, to democratize credit, to take care to regulate quality, and all of that is much harder challenge. And really, most of our countries have moved to a market economy just a couple of decades ago. And many of the questions we ask about why is growth not inclusive or not strong enough, doesn't create jobs, has to do with the simple question of being able to actually create a regulated capitalism that functions, that's dynamic, and that's perceived to be fair. And equally on the second part, to have an effective state as an institution is an extremely complicated proposition given the inheritance of the past. You know, when Dr. Beblawi had to pay, 50% of the budget or so, or 40% in salaries, and yet salaries are more or less below the poverty level. I mean, how do you make such a state efficient? Really, you should be able to double or triple salaries to make the state work, yet it's fiscally totally unfeasible. So the challenge of reforming the institution is truly enormous to be able to get this state's markets with redistribution. So I think one thing Jihad said which is that we should really engage now in shaping an agenda, of a reform agenda with all its complexities that respond to the aspiration of the day is really, I think, the most important, perhaps, what did you call it, color of the day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for all the 5 panelists, in fact, for their enlightening insights. Before I open the floor for the debate, I would like to set some basic rules so that we get the most out of it. Of course, the normal one, please briefly identify yourself, name and affiliation. Do keep your questions and comments short, sharp, and focused in order to allow as many people to participate as possible. And specify whether you have a general question or a comment, or if it is directed to a specific panelist. And do bring the Arab dimension to it, examples, ideas, challenges. We have already a wealth of different challenges that have been raised by the panelists themselves in answering my questions. So let's take, we have time, I think, so let's take 2 rounds maybe of questions. I can bring the panelists in the middle, and then we can wrap up at the end. So the floor is open for debate now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving me the chance to get heard by you, and thank ESCWA for again being in Tunisia between us. هي ملاحظة. Yourself? Yes, I'm Afif Lili, junior consultant for sustainable development. هي ملاحظة بسيطة تجمع عديد الأفكار التي طرحها السادة وأيضا المداخلة. ذكرتم أن العدالة الاجتماعية في المنطقة العربية لازم تمر بدءا بتحديد الأطر المؤسساتية، مراجعة التشريعات، وتحديد المسؤوليات بين المتدخلين في العملية التنموية، لأنه تبين بالكاشف الثغرات الموجودة لتحقيق أي استراتيجية تنمية تهدف إلى العدالة الاجتماعية أو العدالة الاقتصادية. وهنا يمكن المفاهيم يجب أن تكون متوازية. يعني لا نستطيع أن نتحدث عن عدالة اجتماعية دون المرور عبر العدالة الاقتصادية. فالملاحظة التي أردت أن أسوقها هو يمكن تكون الاستراتيجيات الحالية مثالية، ويمكن تكون الأطر المؤسساتية الموضوعة يمكن تكون في معظم الأحيان مدروسة بشكل جيد، لكن التطبيق هو التحدي الأكثر، لأنه عندنا الحاجز الكبير في البلدان العربية ألا وهو الفساد الإداري والمالي في المنظمات الحكومية وغير الحكومية، في القطاع الخاص والعام، وهو يعني النقطة السوداء في تحقيق جميع الاستراتيجيات التنموية. ولا يمكن أن نتحدث عن عدالة اجتماعية دون الحديث عن آلية موازية لمكافحة الفساد. وعندنا أمثلة عديدة لجميع الخطط الموضوعة حتى في إطار ما بعد الانتقال الديمقراطي. أتحدث عن تونس مثلا، كانت هناك عديد الخطوات الفعالة، ولكن عندما تكون الإرادة السياسية موجودة لمكافحة الفساد نحقق أهداف، وإن غابت الإرادة السياسية لا نحقق أهداف. وأريد أيضا أن أذكر إلى أي مدى تكون التربية على التنمية المستدامة والتربية على أهداف التنمية المستدامة education on social justice، إلى أي مدى تكون هذا المفهوم فعال حتى يكون جميع الأطراف المشاركين في العملية التنموية والمواطن في حد ذاته اللي هو يكون يعني يتجاوز دوره كمستفيد من التنمية، يكون فاعل في التنمية، أي دور للتربية في تحقيق العدالة الاجتماعية. وشكرا.
Thank you. Yes, I think is that Egypt there? Yes. Please go ahead.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. بداية أود أن أشكر الحكومة التونسية في حسن الاستضافة، على حسن الاستضافة وعلى التنظيم الجيد بالتعاون مع الإسكوا لهذه الدورة الهامة. كما أشكر الإسكوا وأمينتها العام التنفيذية لاختيار هذا الموضوع لدوراتنا الحالية، حيث أنه يعتبر الموضوع المناسب في الوقت المناسب بعد 3 أو 4 سنوات من تجربة عملية التحول التي نمر بها. أود أن أبلغ رسالة أيضا من السيد وزير الخارجية المصري الذي كان يود أن يكون معكم اليوم، ولكن حالة ظروف المنطقة التي جعلته يحضر عدة اجتماعات تتعلق بالأوضاع في دول المنطقة ليس في الجوانب السياسية التي ليست بعيدة عن التأثيرات الاجتماعية في المنطقة، حيث أنه كان بين باريس ومدريد للاجتماعات التي تعرفونها. سأحاول أن أكون كما طلبت سيادة الرئيس مختصرا جدا في 3 أو 4 تلغرافات، وسأحاول أن أكون أن أنقل لكم صورة عملية من مصر كدولة في منطقة في عملية تحول مستمرة، لكي نحاول أن نمزج بين الحوار الممتع الثري الذي استمعنا إليه من البانيلست في الصباح، والذي كان مزيجا من جوانب كثيرة تعتبر إلى حد كبير نظرية أو واسعة المجال والنطاق، لننتقل إلى الواقع على الأرض ونناقش سويا كيف يمكن تطبيق هذه الجوانب النظرية وما يمكن أن نفعله فيما يتعلق بعملية التحول. الجزء الأول الذي أود أن أشير إليه هو وما تم تناوله من المتحدثين الأجلاء هو تعريف العدالة الاجتماعية. وفي تقديري البسيط هو أن الشارع عرف لنا العدالة الاجتماعية بالفعل في عملية الثورات نفسها عندما خرج إلى الشارع. أشار الأستاذ الديوان أن شعار الثورات أو معظم الثورات كان العيش والحرية والعدالة الاجتماعية، وهو كان تعريف الحقيقة عبقري، لأنه العيش إلى حد كبير هو اختصار للجانب الاقتصادي، الحرية اختصار للجانب السياسي، والعدالة الاجتماعية لم يجد لها اختصارا أكثر من كلمة العدالة الاجتماعية في تعريفها الأساسي. لذا فهذه التجمع، هذا الترياد الثلاثي من المحاور الثلاثة التي نناقشها جميعا متلاحمة، ولكنها تصب لماذا جعلنا العدالة الاجتماعية في النهاية؟ حتى لأنها كل منها يصب في النهاية في العدالة الاجتماعية. إذا كنا نتحدث عن تعريف العدالة الاجتماعية مرة أخرى والاختلاف فيها، أنا أتذكر عندما قامت الثورة في مصر كنت تنزل إلى الشارع تسأل كل شخص حتى عن تعريفه للعدالة الاجتماعية، كانت تختلف عن الآخر. لأحد الشباب كان وظيفة، لأحد المعاقين تحدثت معه بنفسي كان المجرد الحصول على كرسي متحرك، لسيدة كان كما أشارت الأستاذة الفاضلة أستاذتي الفاضلة ميرفت التلاوي، للسيدات كان الحصول على مزيد من الحقوق الغائبة في ظل ما ساد في المجتمع من قبل. فالتعريف حتى ليس فقط ما بين الأكاديميين ولكن في الشارع نفسه، والتعريف يعني ممكن نقول المجرد للعدالة الاجتماعية الوقتية في الوقت الحالي أنا عاوز هذا، ولكن هذا لا يخرجنا من التعريف العام. إذا ناقشت بشكل أكبر سيتطرق إلى عيش كريم، مزيد من الحريات، مزيد من الخدمات، مزيد من المشاركة السياسية، ولكن كل مواطن بيضع ترتيبه بالشكل الذي يراه مختلفا عن الآخر ضمنا لظروفه. وهذا هو التعقيد الذي أراه شخصيا في عملية تعريف العدالة الاجتماعية، لأنها يجب أن تنطلق من أساسيات المجتمع نفسه من كل فرد، المجموعات في المجتمع والأفراد في المجتمع بما يحقق هذا. التلغراف الثاني بيتعلق ب أحد المتحدثين تكلم عن citizen engagement أو people on board، وهناك تجربة تمر بها مصر حاليا لم نشهدها من قبل، وهو كيفية أن تأثير أن يكون الناس، أن يكون هناك people engagement، أو أن يكون هناك دفع اجتماعي أو تجمع في المجتمع حول قضية محددة إذا كانت لها تأثيرها فيما يرونه من تأثير على حياتهم بالشكل الفوري. ما نراه اليوم هو التفاف في المجتمع المصري حول قضية التنمية. لماذا؟ لأنه رأى في القيادة أو في السياسات العامة أو وضع السياسات العامة سواء سياسية أو اقتصادية أو بما فيها في اجتماعية، ستعجبون من مدى تأثير citizen engagement على عملية التنمية. أنا عاوز أضرب مثالين في هذا، مثال منهم لم يكن في مصر ومثال في مصر تكرر خلال الفترة الماضية. كنت مرة في السودان وكان هناك، أخذت تاكسي من، يمكن ده المثالين سيعطوا المبدأ الذي أود أن أشير إليه، أنه مدى الاهتمام المواطن أو رؤية المواطن في أنه جزء من النظام أو جزء من العملية التنموية التي يستمع إليه فيها، تجعله يتحمل الكثير، يعطي understanding أو نوع من التفهم، يعطي وقت ويعطي موارد. ولكن علينا أن نعرف أن هذا لن يكون إنها فرص لا تستمر للأبد، ولكن علينا أن ننتهز هذه الفرص ونزيد منها، ونحن نمر في مصر في هذه الفرصة في الوقت الحالي. المثال الذي رأيته في السودان، أخذت تاكسي في وقت ما من الخرطوم لأم درمان، وكانت أم درمان الخرطوم مضيئة جدا وأم درمان مظلمة شوية، فبقول له طب إيه الحكاية اللي في أم درمان، ليه الدنيا مظلمة؟ فكان رده في منتهى الجمال، قال كده وقال لي بعد 5-6 أمتار سترى محطة كهرباء تبنى ستنير أم درمان في خلال 6 شهور. فآمل أن عنده محطة كهرباء بتبنى ستنير له الطريق، جعلته متفائل أن في 6 شهور سيكون لديه كهرباء. شيء حصل في مصر يمكن سمعتوا عنه من خلال أسبوعين ماضيين، حصل في مصر مشكلة كهرباء كبيرة جدا، تكرر هذا المشهد في مصر بنفس الشيء. سألت أحد الناس في الشارع ما رأيك في هذا؟ رأيه أنه الحكومة بتعمل برغم أنه كانت مشكلة الكهرباء في أوحش 40 درجة، ولكن إحساسه أن هناك مثل هذا الحدث في أي بلد، أنا كنت بتكلم من يومين في برلين، مثل هذا الحدث في أي بلد كان كفيلا بإسقاط أكبر حكومة لها شعبية. أو كيف أخذها المجتمع؟ أخذها المجتمع بشكل إيجابي بسبب أن هناك نوع من الأمل في أن هناك تحرك. فالأمل نفسه، مجرد الأمل في وضع السياسات وأن تجد نفسك في ما تفعله لك الحكومة، سيجعل لنا نجاح أكبر في تحقيق العدالة الاجتماعية. ده آخر نقطة، هما 3 نقاط. النقطة الأخيرة بتتعلق بالتمويل، والذي أشار إليه الأستاذ جهاد، وهي فعلا دايلم، هل سنعتمد على المجتمع الدولي في تمويل عملية التنمية التي ستنعكس على في العملية الاقتصادية؟ هل سننتظر هذا؟ هل سننتظر ما أو سنعتمد على المنطقة أو سنعتمد على الانترنسيك؟ أنا لن أجيب إلى هذا، ولكن علينا أن نضع، إذا رتبنا البيت من الداخل ثم رتبنا منطقتنا من بالمفهوم الأكبر، سينظر إلينا المجتمع الدولي بشكل أفضل وسيجيء إلينا بوسائل التمويل. في الوقت الذي لم ننظم فيه البيت، وسائل التمويل الدولية محجمة على أن تأتي إلينا. أشكر سيادتك وآسف إذا كنت طولت شوي.
Okay, thank you. Let's have one or two more questions before I give a chance to the panel to speak again. So, Oman is first, and then Ziad is the second. Oman first.
شكرا جزيلا. في واقع الأمر أنه يسعدنا فعلا أن يتم تداول مثل هكذا مواضيع تتحدث عن العدالة الاجتماعية في صرح الإسكوا وعلى لجنة وزارية بهذا المستوى. فقط أنا حبيت أن أنوه أن سلطنة عمان مقبلة على إعداد استراتيجية طويلة المدى 2040 وابتدت بوضع دراسة أساسية عن السياسات الاجتماعية ومدى إدماجها في الخطط التنموية. عملت الدراسة عن السياسات الاجتماعية الموجودة، تم إشراك القطاع العام أيضا القطاع الخاص، عمل استبيان وزيارات لمختلف محافظات السلطنة، جمعت البيانات وحللت ودرست وإن شاء الله راح نستفيد منها في الخطة القادمة وفي الاستراتيجية القادمة. الخطة القادمة طبعا الخمسية لتكملة الاستراتيجية الثانية 2016-2020، ثم سيتم الاستفادة من هذه الدراسة في الاستراتيجية طويلة المدى 2040. وشكرا.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. الحقيقة أنا عندي ثلاث قضايا ممكن الواحد يعلق عليهم وإجوا من البانل. الموضوع الأول له علاقة بالإطار المؤسسي الانستتيوشنال فريمورك ودور الدولة في عملية العدالة الاجتماعية أو دور الدولة التنموي بالمفهوم الأشمل. وأنا بتصور أنه نتيجة السيرفي يلي انعملت حول الرأي العام هي معبرة وليست مفاجئة، بمعنى أنه نحن بنعرف نموذجين للدولة. في نموذج حيث دور الدولة هو المسيطر على الإنتاج وعلى كل العملية الاقتصادية، أو النموذج الآخر حيث لا دور للدولة في اقتصاد كامل للسوق. وأنا بتصور أنه النموذجين فشلوا حتى الآن في تجارب الشعوب كلها. لذلك يعني البحث عن النموذج الذي يوائم بين قدر من حرية السوق ولكن دور ناظم للدولة. وأنا بتصور أنه دور الدولة التنموية هو المطلوب عندنا بالمنطقة، وهيدا الجهد اللي يفترض أن ينعمل. أي دور للدولة وشو هو الدوز، يعني شو هي المعايير التي ممكن يوقف عندها. إذن السؤال الأول هو دائما لازم يكون في جهد حول البحث الإطار المؤسسي ودوره. السؤال الثاني هو الحقيقة حول موضوع العدالة في التوزيع وماذا نفهم يعني وكيف نفهم موضوع العدالة في التوزيع. وأنا بتصور أنه في 4 قضايا أساسية أو 3 قضايا أساسية يفترض أن تؤخذ بعين الاعتبار وهي متكاملة. الضريبة أو السياسة الضريبية أو النظام الجبائي هو جزء من إعادة التوزيع، من جزء من إعادة توزيع الثروات، وليس فقط أداة من أدوات تعظيم المداخيل في إطار الدولة. وبالتالي عندما نتحدث عن إعادة توزيع معناته بدها تتوسع القاعدة الضريبية وبدهم يتوسعوا المستهدفين من النظام الضريبي، مش بس اللي المتاحين. موضوع الأجور يعني يجب أن ينظر إلى الأجور كمان كجزء من آليات إعادة التوزيع، والصراع على تصحيح أو تحسين الأجور بما يساهم في زيادة القدرات الاستهلاكية هي جزء من التوزيع كمان لهذه الثروات. ومفهوم الخدمات الاجتماعية والسياسات الاجتماعية هي جزء من التوزيع، بمعنى أنه يدفع ضرائب ليتلقى ذلك. وبالتالي عم أقول ذلك حتى أقول أنا أنه يعني عادة عندما نتحدث عن تحفيز الاستثمار يكون ذلك على حساب يعني التسهيلات الضريبية والتسهيلات الاستثمارات اللي بتجي غالبا على حساب المكلفين. السياسات التقشفية أو التدابير التقشفية التي تتخذ بما فيهم موضوع الدعم. يعني أنا بتصور أنه في إمكان يعني التدابير التقشفية تلجم الاقتصاد ولا تعزز الدورة الاقتصادية وتأتي غالبا على حساب المهمشين، ويعني تخلخل مبدأ العدالة وإعادة التوزيع. في نقطة ثالثة بتصور لها علاقة بالسياسة الاجتماعية بشكل عام أو العدالة الاجتماعية. أنا بتصور أنها ترتكز إلى 3 قضايا يفترض أن تؤخذ بعين الاعتبار. الموضوع الأول هو التمييز، يعني لا يمكن أن يكون هناك عدالة اجتماعية في إطار التمييز. التمييز بكافة أشكاله، يعني التمييز على المستوى الجغرافي، تمييز بين المرأة والرجل، تمييز على المستوى الاجتماعي وإلى آخره. الموضوع الثاني هو حق تقرير المصير، والحقيقة حق تقرير المصير مش بس منوط في الشعوب الواقعة تحت الاحتلال واللي محرومة من حقها في أن تختار، لا، حق تقرير المصير هو حق الشعوب أن تختار نمطها التنموي وأن تشارك في رسم مستقبلها وإلى آخره، وبالتالي يرتكز إلى منظومة من المبادئ السياسية والمشاركة. وبتصور انه ما ممكن نحكي عن عدالة اجتماعية بدون ما يكون في مبادئ كالمساءلة والمشاركة هن في صلب هذا الموضوع. يعني الانماط التنموية ما بتصور انه في واحد بيقدر يفتح انسيكلوبيدي ويقول هذا النمط اللي بدي نقيه، بس ولكن في دائما من خلال التجارب قدرة على التحسين والتطوير والمساءلة والمحاسبة والى اخره. اذا بدون مساءلة ومشاركة يمكن كتير صعب نحكي عن عدالة اجتماعية. شكرا.
Okay, thank you to the audience for, there are 3 or 4 points that are coming out of the audience I would like to bring to the attention of our speakers. First of all, is this idea of the concept of social justice. Are you getting it right? I mean, those 4 basic pillars that you have determined, are they right? Or shall we go for some core values and then think about how to apply them in terms of their political dimensions, their feasibility at the national level? This is one set of comments. The second one is this whole issue of institutional development, which started here from the panel. The audience have picked up, and they've had some very critical issues here, like, for example, corruption and frauds, and this whole issue of accountability. So that's a second set of issues for discussion. Then there are some very specific processes taking place right now in terms of the transitional process. Some countries in the region are going through this process of democratic transition, which is part and parcel of the social justice agenda. In some cases, somebody mentioned this is coming, the definition from the streets, if you like. So that's another question for us to think about. That's, do we need, for example, a new social contract, and what should it be like? What's the role of the state in the market? This was questioned as well from the floor. And then lastly, there is this issue of discrimination. I think I will start with Mr. Al-Nasser first. Can you tell us a little bit about how to handle this issue of discrimination, of inclusion, if you want to have the other face or the side of the coin? How do you handle those questions?
Thank you. لا شك النقاش كان غني وعميق. مفهوم العدالة الاجتماعية مثل ما ذكرت، مثل ما سمعنا من الحضور، له عدة دلائل، لكن نحن نتكلم الآن عن المنطقة العربية ودور الإسكوا. أنا أرى أن الدور الكبير يقع على جامعة الدول العربية التي تحتضن كل أعضاها. لا شك مسؤولية حتى نصل إلى مبتقانا هو على الحكومات مسؤولية كبيرة في التنمية الإنسانية حتى نصل إلى عدالة اجتماعية من خلال ثقافتنا، مثل ما تفضلت الدكتورة تلاوي. نحن يجب أن نستفيد ونتعلم من دروس ناجحة كثيرة موجودة في العالم، لكن من خلال إطار الثقافة الخاصة بنا. لا شك هذا يعني لنطبق العدالة الاجتماعية هناك يجب أن يكون في حكم رشيد، good governance، شفافية، احترام حقوق الإنسان، محاربة الفساد. هناك مسؤولية جماعية في المجتمع، وليس نحن نضع العبء كله على دور الحكومة. هناك مسؤولية كبيرة تقع على المجتمع المدني، على رجال الدين، على رجال الأعمال، حتى نصل إلى ما نصبو إليه. شكرا.
Thank you. Dr. Tilawi, this question of the rights-based approaches was also raised in the audience. Now, inclusion that also leads to social cohesion, and if you see the other side of the coin, that would prevent social conflict. How can you tackle this issue?
Thank you very much. Let me first say that I agree with Ambassador Nasser that, is it working? That we are grateful that it started with this, started raising this issue, and I hope it will continue, because it leads a lot of study and understanding. Maybe the president, the minister would understand this, but the other level under the minister, it would take them time to understand. So we need like a cultural revolution, change in the mentality. Understand what is not human rights only between the government and the individual, but within the family itself. This is very important, how we treat each other within the family, within the community. Ambassador Radi said that the hope is essential given this transitional period where we are. I agree with him, and I add to what he said, the link between the president or the leadership and the individual, the citizen, this confidence building between the two is very essential. I'll give you an example. What happened to Egypt, in Egypt, as a result of digging this project of the new Suez Canal. The government collected 64 billion Egyptian pound in 8 days. The people are rushing, and they want to continue to do that, although we have reached the target. At the same time, the government have removed the price of electricity and the gasoline and so on. So they removed the subsidy, some percentage of the subsidies. We expected the opposite from the people. But although they have removed some of the subsidies and raised the prices, they compensate with other ways and means. And one of the most important compensation is this seriousness by the government to do. People are patient, and they are ready to be patient for another period, provided that you are serious in your decision and you implement it. This is the crux of the matter. So, number two, the distinguished representative of Oman, I'm happy to hear what he said, because this is the right track to make the bureaucracy understand what is social justice, namely to have surveys, detailed surveys in all the localities, not only in the capital, but at the most remote area of the country. Based on this, you can put a right policy for social justice. This is very essential. Finally, the finance. The finance I think we have a lot of waste in the Arab countries. Before we ask for money from outside, we have to rethink the waste in many aspects, in many ways in our lives. We can save a lot of money by reshaping, reforming the way we are doing. Even the subsidies are very badly used. It's a waste of money. It doesn't go to the poor. So we need to do that in our way of eating, of cooking, of buying. We buy more than what we want, we eat more than what it's supposed to be, and so on and so forth. So we should rethink of the way we are running the country, how our budget is spent, and don't forget the will of the people. The people sometimes are richer than the country, than the government. So at least certain layers of the people, if we can seduce them to the projects, then I believe trust can happen, confidence can happen, and money could be provided. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Zaur, what could you say about some of those economic-oriented questions that came from the panel, including the question of social contract, including the question of the role of the market in the state, and fiscal policy?
Well, I think we started with this issue as a slogan, shi'ar. It was at several instances mentioned. And now we are moving to the definition of the concept. The representative of Kuwait put the concept at very high level, i.e. moral, religious, political. If we take the other extreme, what is going on in OECD, for example, it's more focused, specific, addressing some well-defined targets. I think the issue is going to be, for us today at this juncture, is where to put the bar. Where is the definition, or what type of social justice we want to achieve? Is it something that is in order to reduce disparities, achieve income equality, achieve access to services, or we want to achieve something that is broader? And I think this is the risk that we are facing today. The risk is we don't have specific concept, that this concept will lead us, in fact, to have different interpretations. From an economic perspective, it's clear that there is a connotation in the term of social justice, the way it's being presented. It is this framework that, in fact, is putting social justice as an economic model whereby we are more promoting stronger social involvement of the state. I'm not quite sure that this is the right concept or the wrong concept. But I think we need to clarify it. And this exercise that we are doing today, I'm sure that others will continue it, will be to decide what is the framework we want to base our policies on. Is it certain number of specific targets, or is it the whole model that we want to change? The third aspect, I think we are also mixing things. Having an accountability is not only important for social justice, it is important for good governance, even if you have a very liberal socio-economic model. Fight corruption is not only for the target of achieving more social justice, it is to have good governance framework. And therefore, I think we need also here to be specific enough in order to be effective in achieving the objectives. And therefore, I think going back to what has been said, both on what the policies to be implemented and what are the aims of this concept of social justice, if we are going to continue to be broad and unspecific, we are not going to achieve an objective of bringing up the level of social justice. Last point, the concept of social justice is a relative concept. It's not an absolute concept. It is relative to your ability to move up. It's also relative to your means, and it's relative to the gap that exists in the system. If you are in a society where you have large gaps, your aspiration is to reach some level of equalization. If we're talking about social justice in a society like, for example, Switzerland is different from a society where the gaps are big. And therefore, I think here we need to also be more realistic on how we address it, on what this concept of social justice will bring us. It's not the magic solution of all our problems, and I think part of this exercise of framing it, making it as a concrete concept to work toward achieving, requires to be very clear, very transparent and honest about how this concept of social justice should evolve, or what are the objectives, the targets, the policies. Bring it down from something that is, highly aspirational to something that is more tangible and concrete. And it's a social choice. Is social justice is going to be our main objective in society, and therefore we need to think the institutions, we need to think our economic system and our social system, or it's part of addressing some of the problems and the difficulties that led to the situation that triggered in 2011 this massive transformation. And I think, I'm not sure yet that we have, at least in the region, reached a common ground on what to put under this heading, what are the targets that we are able to achieve in the medium term, and ultimately what the social justice will bring to us in terms of stability, in terms of the future of the region, and how sustainable are our aspirations. Can we achieve them? And if we want to achieve them, what are the means?
Okay, thank you. Dr. Jost, very briefly, this question of national approaches that are indigenous, that really build on Arab values, how does that tie up with this kind of general concepts that you exposed in your presentation?
Yes, thank you. I'll be very brief. I know we're past time. But I agree completely with what's been said along these lines. The most of the comments and remarks I made were about general theories and general approaches to the questions of social justice. Maybe some other examples in other parts of the world will be useful as analogs, but what the real work obviously has to be done by members of leaders in individual member countries to make any of these solutions be culturally appropriate and so on. And so I think it's tremendously important, and I want to thank you for your attention, and also if there's anything I can provide additionally, people should feel free to follow up with me. I'd be happy to help in whatever ways I can. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Diwan, lastly, this question again, I want to bring that you raised this point about market versus the state. Doesn't the state has got a critical role here in pushing a social justice agenda? Once you define it properly, okay, is there a very strong role for the state to redress, for example, past injustices, poverty, the whole issue of freedoms and so forth? Isn't there a strong role for the state here?
I think the state is central here, because the whole thing, in my mind, is about the balance and the how-to between state and market in making a new system work. So, I would argue to Jihad's question that we do need to investigate more what social justice means. in my mind, it's a mix of solidarity and equality of opportunity that John spoke about. You know, equalizing opportunities, having fairness, basically. Basically allowing social mobility, the way we have seen happening over the 60s and the 70s. I mean, there's this memory of social progress that I think is pushing people. You know, the Gini coefficients are low in the region. There's always been this mystery. There's not much inequality. Why people care so much about inequality? It's probably because it's about social progress more than keeping the status quo, the way it is. And so if you take it this way, and back to your question, Federico, about the role of the state, it's really social justice is at the heart of the development model. It makes it work. It's not just inefficiencies of taxation that Ibn Khaldun told us about a long time ago. It's at the opposite. It creates positive externalities that lead to growth in at least three ways. You know, first, it makes the market economy socially acceptable and legitimate because it's fair, it benefits everyone, everybody has equal opportunities. When people fall in the cracks, they're helped back. And so it's morally acceptable. I think it's a very strong point that the representative from Kuwait made. Second, it allows to have social justice allows policymakers to be much more flexible in terms of making policies, right? I mean, it's very hard to make policy when you're always afraid of the street rising. And what we've seen with the Washington Consensus and these structural adjustment reform is, you know, very small marginal reforms taking 2 decades because they're not legitimate, because there is no social safety net, very difficult to take out the subsidies and the like. So it makes policy possible, you know, a point, say, Danny Roderick has made. If you don't have a safety net or you don't have a good education system, you can't have an open trade policy. You know, you just want the status quo. You can't take advantage of global innovations. And the third point, which is connected to corruption and cronyism, which I think Jihad is part of the Arab social justice agenda because it is part of the same kind of moral compact on the one hand, and it's also because it's connected to fairness. It's grossly unfair that some people become billionaires just because of connections where others are working hard and not getting anywhere. So, you know, in that agenda, the problem with cronyism is one of growth. It is not a system that grows very fast because, you know, what gives you growth in a market economy is competition at the end of the day. And if you have a market economy without competition, you're not going to have growth, as we've seen. So I would, you know, agreeing with all of that, I think what this discussion is telling us is really much more in the Arab region. Social justice is at the heart of a growth system, a development system that would work. And just to conclude, I mean, the Egyptian delegate, I think, put something very good on the table, which is if you give people hope that you're going in the right direction, they can take the costs, right? And that's very important. I mean, we shouldn't advise policymakers to be myopic now and to say you have to deliver immediately. People know you cannot deliver immediately, but if you set up the right strategies that would lead in time. You want to add something? Yes, that lead in time to the right solution, they would know that and they would be patient.
An exception for you, please.
I'll be participating in the next panel, so I was wondering whether I said it now or to the next one. I would like to say something about the state. The state, particularly, I'm referring to our experience in Egypt. The state in Egypt is a mixed blessing. Without the state, the country would have collapsed. The only guarantee for Egypt to continue is that we have a strong state. But because we have a strong state, this state is preventing us from moving ahead. So it's a playing a role, maintaining the status quo in every respect, preventing it from going down, and to a great extent, preventing it from going up. This is our dilemma with the state. Thank you.